Hi everyone, this is Kelly and I am here tonight with another Divination Spotlight. This is just a quick little series for the month of October, going through and looking at different forms of divination, giving sort of their basic history and their basic constructs and how they are how they work, and why you might use this particular form of divination over, say, another one. What are their strengths? Maybe what are the weaknesses? What is it about this that would make you want to use this particular form over another form? So we, of course, have to talk about tarot, right? This is certainly a form of divination that most likely to anybody watching my channel is familiar with. However, sometimes we do actually have new people to divination and or to tarot, and so I'm not going to leave this one out of the equation either. So today we're going to talk a little bit about tarot. I have just a few decks here that kind of cross a spectrum. It is not inclusive of everything across the ages, but just to kind of give that kind of historical perspective. So we have here this is a copy of the Visconti Sforza from the early to mid 1400s, and this is a stunning deck that had individually painted cards that were, I think this is probably fairly close to accurate in size, and you have, of course, your major arcana and you have your minor arcana as swords and cups and coins and wands, or batons as they might have been called. Of course, they wouldn't have been in English, right? And so here we have a really early example of a deck of tarot cards. So we can see that this isn't a modern form of divination. Of course, it is also not one of the older types of divination where you look at geomancy, which we will talk about. You can see examples of that back even to the 800s. And of course, there are other divination systems such as I Ching that are even older than that. So while tarot is certainly an old divination, it is not the oldest form of divination. But it is a beautiful form of divination that consists of 78 cards that has a major arcana which sort of follows that idea of the Fool's Journey. We'll talk a little bit more about that individually here in a moment, but it sort of follows a journey through experience that a person might have in sort of becoming a full and complete human being, from the Fool card to the World card of sense of completion, although sometimes the Fool is actually set at the end of the major arcana, in which they go through all of this in order to then turn back right around and be able to face the world with eyes wide open and ready for adventure, despite and because of everything learned. So the Fool can go on either side. And then there is a minor arcana that is very much related and comes from playing cards as we would know it, where there are 4 suits with number cards from ace to 10, and then a court card, while we were maybe used to a tradition of a 3 court card of Jack, Queen, and King in a sort of modern representation of playing cards. This we would have seen we see a page, knight, Queen, and King, but again, we can see those correlations to playing cards very much, with the cups being related to the hearts, the spades being related to the swords, the clubs to the wands, and the diamonds to the pentacles. And this game indeed was used to play a game called Taroki, or Taroki, or Tarochi, however that might be spelled, but it was and is still used today to play a card game. As with many things that are normal parts of our everyday life, they are picked up and used for divination. Now, there is certainly lots of discussion across the ages of what was the original origins of tarot, that the playing card game was just a way of hiding its true esoteric nature, that it originated from Egypt, or it originated from the gypsies, or it originated from Egypt and then the gypsies disseminated it out into the world, and probably probably multitudes of other historical theories on where tarot came from and whether or not it was a playing card game to start that morphed into a form of divination, or if it was esoteric knowledge that was hidden within the game of a playing card game. In the end, for me personally, it doesn't matter either way. Whether the Egyptians developed it or the Romani people developed it or just disseminated it across the different cultures, whether it came from Atlantis or whether it was a playing card game that tapped into basic archetypes that we understood and we attributed and over the years have learned and layered meanings and associations to. Either way, in the end, for me, it doesn't matter, because now in 2017, it does have a long history. It has a long list of associations, and those archetypal associations, energetic associations, allow me to tap into getting messages on any particular situation. So this deck here we have this is from the 1400s. This is a reproduction of the Dodao, which would have been from the 1700s, when, before mass printing, these types of Marseille style woodblock was the mass market of the time, in which they could literally stamp color and stamp images by hand, of course, but it was a way of actually mass producing, for its time period, mass producing sets of cards. And so this is from the 17th century. This is a beautiful one that would have been painted, which is the Neoclassico. This is from the 1800s. There's a lot of beautiful decks in the 1800s that were either painted or etched. There's lots of different forms and styles of cards leading up to the 1900s, where we do see the Rider-Waite-Smith come about out of the Golden Dawn. So the Golden Dawn was an esoteric society, and as part of keeping track of all of their esoteric correspondences and their studies that they did and the lore that they did and the work that they did, they would in certain points they would rise to a level in which they would create, there was a single tarot deck that held like all of the correspondences, sort of in code. All of their mystery, esoteric knowledge was encoded into it, and each person reaching a certain level would create a tarot deck, their own version of that tarot deck. And so we can actually see two of those in the Thoth Tarot from Crowley and in the Rider-Waite-Smith from A.E. Waite, the illustrator of that deck being Pamela Coleman Smith, and is probably the most recognizable in the English-speaking world of a tarot deck, because it really took the world by storm. It was able to be mass-produced. It was put out. The images were easier to interpret than 4 batons or 2 swords on a pip deck. It was easier to see a scene, so it was easier for people to look at this and develop their associations to what these cards might mean when you had these sort of scenic cards on here. And so this is a deck that was definitely influential in moving tarot forward, especially in the English-speaking world. I do have a pet peeve when the Rider-Waite-Smith is called the mother of tarot. This was in obviously the early 1900s, and we're looking at tarot decks going back into the 1400s. So this is not the mother of tarot. It is just sort of a big corner turning on the history of tarot, but it is certainly not the mother of tarot. And so that's a little bit of a pet peeve with me, but it is a beautiful system. But it is a system. So you have sort of the framework of tarot, and then there is placed a system that comes from correspondences, a lot of them astrological, from the Kabbalah, different correspondences of the Golden Dawn Society placed on these different cards and turned into the Rider-Waite-Smith system, for which we have many decks today that are based on this particular system. So that would be the Rider-Waite-Smith. Another person in the Golden Dawn, or part of the Golden Dawn, would have been Crowley, and this is the Thoth tarot, which was, again, his interpretation, his way of taking the correspondences of the Golden Dawn and placing them onto a tarot deck. And his is much more pip-like. He has some beautiful minors with pips in them rather than scenes, but the use of the painter here, which was Lady Harris, Lady Frida Harris, who was, did an amazing job. Even though these are pip style, in which you have just a certain, you have really people in the numbered cards, the use of color, the use of symbols, the use of geometrics, all sort of lend itself to giving still a understanding of what the card means through the illustration. So this would have been another version or another interpretation of the Golden Dawn on top of the basic framework of a tarot deck. And so then we started to obviously see in the 1900s and then in, of course, the 2000s, we have seen a huge boom of decks. Some of them are just new artwork for the same system as we see here in the Rider-Waite-Smith. This is a beautiful example in the Darkness of Light Tarot, which is one of my current ones I'm using a lot. It has very Rider-Waite-Smith type structure, although it does veer away from it as well slightly, but it has very similar where you have the scenics, and it is very similar in structure to the Rider-Waite-Smith. It's just kind of going from new perspective, adding its own layers, these types of things. So we have multitudes of decks. We also do have decks, modern decks, that are pip decks. Now this one is actually what I would consider a bit of a blend between pip style, pre-Rider-Waite-Smith and Rider-Waite-Smith, because the minors, while they are just pips, they actually have scenic representations that are much more similar to the Rider-Waite-Smith there. But it's a beautiful kind of blending of the both of them in the pagan other worlds. These are just decks I happen to have sitting right here, and that's why I'm using them. But there are, as you probably know, a multitude of decks. But what makes a tarot deck a tarot deck? Because this is just supposed to be, in a nutshell, right? This is not supposed to be everything you need to know about tarot, but in a nutshell, what sets tarot apart from other styles of cartomancy? So cartomancy is simply reading or divining with cards, whether that be playing cards, whether that be Lenormand cards, which we'll talk, all of those things that I'm mentioning, we will have their own little snapshots, whether we be talking about Kipper cards or Sibylla cards or Gypsy Witch cards. All of those are oracle cards. Those are all forms of cartomancy. What makes tarot different from those? Well, the difference is in a very specific structure. Now, I'm using here the Wild Witch, which actually follows the structure of tarot, but at the same time, it is not a Rider-Waite-Smith It doesn't go off of the Rider-Waite-Smith. It has its own system based on the Wheel of the Year, but it is still a tarot deck because it has a major arcana. And these are in order. That's why I'm using this. I had to purchase a second copy of this deck because I messed up trimming. Oops, I'm going too far into, there we go. So we have the Fool. There's 22 cards in the major arcana, starting or ending with a Fool, either way. And then we have a basic structure. Now, sometimes the names gets changed. So in this deck, it's the Shaman, but it could be the Magician, right? This is a card that is talking about how you have everything that you need within yourself. You have everything that you need to manifest your power, to manifest energy. We have a High Priestess card in this deck. It is changed to the Seer, but it is still the High Priestess card, right? We have in this card, we have the Green Man and the Green Lady. These would be the Empress and the Emperor. So even though this deck may have changed the names, it is still a tarot deck. It has 22 major arcanas, and it has 56 minor arcanas, which have a court card, 4 court cards, which would be some representation of page knight, queen, and king, or sometimes son, father, son, mother, and daughter, which we see actually in the Thoth. We also see, at least we have a prince and a princess, a king and a queen. We have some decks that have son and daughter and mother and father, but it is that sort of court hierarchy there. And then we have from ace here to tens and of number cards. This specific structure is what makes a deck a tarot deck. And one of the beauties of working with a tarot deck is because of that very structure. Each of the suits represent to different things to different people. They have developed sort of elemental associations. I don't know if this one is in order. It looks like it might be. It is also in German. But we have pentacles, which are also coins sometimes, which can be stones, other things of that nature. It is generally associated with earth, right? We also have sword suit, which is generally sword suit. Sometimes they are, I think this arrow is in this deck, but swords generally stay the same, but they would have been spades in playing card. They are very often associated with air, although not always. Sometimes they are associated with fire, and I have even seen decks in the card system where they are associated with water, but they have elemental associations to them. We also have the suit of cups, which can generally are cups, but it's or some kind of bowl or cauldron or some sort of holding device of that nature, which are very often associated with water, although again one system I know associates cups with air. And then we have the suit of wands or staves or batons or bows in this one, which are very often associated with fire, but can also be associated with air. So even the correspondences that we put to these are layers, and so what you decide to do with those layers are going to be up to you and up to the deck that you're using. But because of that very specific structure, it makes another layer when you pull a set of cards. So for example, when you pull a set of cards, let's just pull 3 cards here. We have certain things going on. If we say to ourselves, if our correspondence to the pentacles or the coins has to do with earth, that tells us something. We have, okay, this is talking about groundedness, this is rootedness, this is the physicality of life here. We have the page, and for many people the pages are in beginning energy, just starting to learn sort of energy. They're the youngest of the courts, right? And so we might see the beginning of groundedness, we might see the beginning of learning, we might see many different things that we might associate and tie into earth, physicality, learning a trade, learning maybe actually going to school and learning things, depending on what you associate with the pentacles or the earth suit. And then when we get the cups, depending on the question, we can say, okay, this is cups. This is talking about our feelings and our emotions or the ways that we connect to other people. And here we have the number 2, which is a connective number. It's a number of duality. It's a coming together of emotions and connections with other people that we might be able to lay. Because this has its own suit, it's not just this card sitting by itself, but it's this card associated with all the associations of its suit. Same thing with this. Oh, here's the High Priestess. Whoa, she's from the Major Arcana, right? So we know that she's got some extra oomph. She's got some extra power. She's talking about bigger, overreaching things versus more of the day-to-day concerns of the suits. And so we can say this is really about digging into our intuition. This is really about diving into down there where the magic and the connection with spirit and the connection with our intuition and our magic is. And that takes on a deeper connotation because we know it's part of the Major Arcana. So having this structure to tarot gives it a lot of extra layers. Having the longevity of tarot from in the 1400s, we also have many things that people can choose or not choose to layer on top, such as astrology, such as Kabbalah, such as elemental associations, those types of things that we can then layer on top to gain meaning, add more meaning, or subtract meanings and take it down. I primarily read, while I do read with decks that are Rider-Waite-Smith based, my primary base for reading is numerological plus elemental. So I love to use pip style decks like this because I simply look to the number 2, 4, 6, right? So 6 of coins or 6 of pentacles. 6 is another number of harmony for me. Pentacles is the number for earth, for physicality, for sometimes money. So I would say, oh, well, this is talking about harmonizing, right? Harmonizing by becoming grounded, harmonizing our finances, depending on the question. And so I can plug in simply, okay, this is a suit of air and the number 2. So we have duality in the mind, polarity maybe in the mind, depending on the question and the situation that it's in. And so you can strip it back as far as you want or layer on as much as you want, because there are so many different ways to read tarot. There's 100 different books and plus on how to read tarot, and every single one is going to be slightly different. There'll be similarities, but there will be slight differences there. And so it makes it for a very multi-dimensional divination system that is a true joy to read with, and it has a lot of depth. So why would I choose this over another one? For me, this is very much a divination system of the mind. For me personally, everybody's going to go different here, and of course, and the intuition. But I love the puzzle pieces. I love the differing suits. I love the differing numbers versus courts versus major arcana. I love looking and scanning at a full spread and seeing, okay, well, we've got 3 wands over here. There's a lot of fire going on. We've got, okay, it's a puzzle. For me, it's very puzzle making, and how do those pieces fit together, and how does that end up making this whole story? Doesn't mean that doesn't happen in other divination systems, but for me, it really engages the mind. It really engages the psychology of archetypes for me, and it's just an engaging and very in-depth form of divination that is, of course, one of my favorites and one of my most used forms of divination. So again, this is just, the intention of this is just to be a snapshot of this particular form of divination. People always say, what do you recommend if you're starting out with wanting to try? Maybe you've always been somebody who's read Oracle and you're thinking, you know what, I might like to try the structure of tarot a little bit more and see how I get on with that. Now, what do you recommend? I personally recommend a Rider-Waite-Smith deck. This is a version of the Rider-Waite-Smith. There are tons of them out there in various different colorations. I personally like the one that's easily available in English. I personally like the Centennial version of the Rider-Waite-Smith. I just like the coloration, but there are tons out there. Many, many books reference this deck, so I think that it is great to have a copy of it as a reference, even if it's not a deck that you actually use. Like me, this isn't a deck that I generally, it doesn't mean I don't ever, I certainly do at times, but it's very few and far between, but I always like to have a copy of it on hand. I also recommend having a pip deck. One of my favorites, which is of course not here, which is crazy, is a very easily available by Los Scarabeo called Tarot of the Ancients. It's an absolutely beautiful pip style deck, and I highly recommend that as a pip style so that you can just play around with. What does this mean? What does this number mean to you? What does this element mean to you? What do those mean together, right? It gives you, if you're new to it, it gives you, instead of waiting until you're really into one system, gives you a little bit of a broad knowledge of both pips and scenic decks. And thirdly, if you want a third deck, just picking one randomly that you absolutely love the look of, and a good guidebook. So again, just a quick snapshot. Well, we couldn't leave tarot out. There are a ton of videos here on my channel about tarot spreads, all kinds of things. There is a comparison series that I started my channel off with that I never finished, that was going through the major arcana. I need to see where I was at, but it was pretty far in, enough where you could really start to see kind of some different examples of the different cards. But there's just, just Google, search tarot in my thing. I think I also have a playlist on tarot. There are a ton of videos on tarot, but I didn't want to leave it off of the snapshots because it is a form of divination, and this is a divination snapshot. So I hope you've enjoyed this, and let me know maybe down in the comments if you do read tarot, what is your favorite deck for reading. I know nobody likes to pick one. I don't like to pick one. It changes all the time. I'm definitely using the Darkness of Light Tarot a lot right now, and I'm obviously using the Pagan Otherworlds a lot because these are on my reading table, which generally indicates which ones I'm currently reading a lot of. But I do have quite a few decks, and I pull from them all. But those are the two that right now have my attention. So have an absolutely wonderful day, and I will see you next time for the next divination snapshot.